when you challenge people on the evidence about the resurrection existing, have you ever heard the book The Case for Christ? I don't know. Have you heard of this?
feel like
It's
I
old.
have. I feel like I have. I feel like people have left comments about it and been like, "I need you. Like, you should read this book. You should check out
Look,
this book." And I never actually got around to it. But what's it about?
oh my God. So The Case for Christ, I read it while I was a Christian. And so it's a book about this guy named Lee Strobel is the guy who wrote it. And he was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune or something like that. And he writes about his experience, and he's a reporter, and he wants to do this investigative report onto Christianity and the origin of the religion. So he goes and travels around the country talking to different Bible scholars. And he says he was an atheist and he didn't believe it. And so he was just going around, just asking questions. And I read this book, and it was the most disappointing read of my entire life, because he's saying, well, I converted to Christianity at the end of this journey because everything they told me just made so much sense. And he would ask questions like, so you're saying that the tomb was empty? Yes, it was. He's like, oh my God, I didn't know that. And it's like, okay, but I don't believe this for a fucking second. Like the entire book is just like 9 chapters of confirmation bias. I don't even believe the guy was an atheist, because as a Christian,
that's what I was about to say. I was like, it sounds like just a Christian who said atheist and then was like converted. Now you can too. Like,
right. Yes, that's exactly what it is. It is as a believer, I read this and said, this is dog shit. Like, this is absolutely terrible, because it used a lot of the arguments that I've heard over the years that would just make me, they would say stuff like, well, the 500 witnesses. It's like, who? Who
are these witnesses? Who are they? I need names. I need dates of birth and deaths. That's what I need. Who are these?
Literally anything. These witnesses, you can't give me one witness of this. You can't give me one. And
the problem with that too is the fact that the witnesses that were there weren't the ones who wrote it. No one who was there wrote it.
Yeah, it's at best it's secondhand information from 500 witnesses. That's what you're giving me. You're telling me to buy that. And how many times you heard the empty tomb, man? The empty tomb.
They're like, but he rose. But he rose, and it's like, okay, like,
it's like,
what else?
Disregarding the fact that you don't know if this empty tomb is real or not. Like, you have no idea. You're just asserting that it is. And second, let's say there was an empty tomb. You still got quite a bit of work ahead of you to prove that this was a miraculous resurrection of a man that had been dead for a day and a half. Like, you've really got a lot of work here. And they just confidently state this shit, and people buy it. I was like,
it's so strange. And I would tell you, like, as like when you grow up in it, I feel like only half of them fully believe it. The other half of them only like halfway believe it, but the doubts that they do have, they are pushing to the side. And I know that because I did it. There were so many times where people would say something that would like pop up, and I would be like, oh, well, this, and this, or we're not supposed to know. It's not for us to know. We're not supposed to question God. We're not supposed to do this. We're not supposed to do that. And so it's like some of them fully believe it, like 100% fully believe it, 10 toes down. That's their belief. But there are some people out there who legitimately are just kind of going with it because they're like, well, I don't get it, but what else do I have? I'm with this. And it's really sad because that's how I lived my life for like most of the time that I was a Christian.
In my experience, that's most of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the vast majority of them. Because look, one of the biggest disappointments that I've had, people continue to underwhelm me in my life. It's just I should stop having expectations so high. But I was really annoyed how few Christians actually gave a shit about what was in the Bible. Like they don't know. They don't know. And you ask these questions and they say, well, listen, because I do get the pushing the doubts aside. I understand it completely, because once you start, it's uncomfortable to question this shit. And then you know that, okay, if this falls apart, what do I have? Because now I'm stuck in a terrifying universe with no one looking out for me or my family. And I could get hit by a truck tomorrow. Like, that's scary. You don't want to deal with that.
In the beginning, it's absolutely terrifying. I remember when I first deconstructed, it took, I want to say, even now, I still have like a tiny bit of like a fear of death, but I was petrified of death when I first deconstructed, because it wasn't like what what Christians don't understand about deconstruction is most people aren't trying to deconstruct when it happens.
Nope.
And so it's like, I've heard so many stories of people being like, I was trying to strengthen my relationship with God. I was reading the Bible to try to get closer to God. I was one of those people. And it's when you're going through and you're searching it, it is the most gut-wrenching, like horrible feeling, because it's like everything was a lie. Nothing was real. Everything that I've ever known, everything that I was ever taught, all of it. And then when you look back and you like when your family is religious, it's even harder because you see your family still following that religion that you just left. And it's kind of just like, you are still so in this bubble, and I'm sitting on the outside of it and I can see what's happening, and it's terrifying to me, which is one of the reasons why that I had to distance myself from my family, because religious, and when it's someone like me, especially with the content that I make, because whether my family knows it or not, I know they've seen my stuff. Do I block them? Yes. Do they still see my stuff? Absolutely. They make burner accounts or whatever they can do, I swear. But it's so difficult when you deconstruct, and it's a lonely period and people don't understand that. You feel angry. And so when we deconstructed, people be like, oh, you just wanted to sin. No. Far from that. I wanted to believe so bad. I wanted to have it so bad. And so it's gut-wrenching. It's horrible. And so it's not something that people do lightly. It's not something that people just one day decide, oh, I don't believe in God anymore. Forget that. That's, at least maybe some people do that.
I can't imagine. Well, you know what? I can imagine that for someone who didn't have like a deep, like a satisfying faith and relationship with God. Like someone who just is nominally a Christian, I can see that for them. Sorry. But for folks like us so I always say that the time I deconstructed was the worst time of my life. It was, man, very unprofessional. I'm like coughing up there, but it was the worst time of my life because I told you, like, not only did I have to end that relationship, or end it. I mean, I would have said, but she couldn't do it. I don't blame her for that.
They're so big on that equally yoked thing. It's insane.
And which is another thing that's weird to tell people. They're like, she broke up with you because you didn't have. Look, you don't get it, man. You know,
yeah, no, it's such a huge thing for them. It's insane. I had it in my head. I was like, I'm gonna have a Christian husband, and we're gonna live a life of God together, and all of this. And so, yeah, no, they will not pair up with anyone if they don't follow their same faith. Sometimes even if they're like not the same denomination. Like,
yeah. If it's the wrong denomination, then you might as well. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, well, we don't believe in the same stuff, even though we read the same Bible. I'm like, I don't understand it, but continue.
Yeah. And so I always said that the best way she's the only person I told, by the way, at the time. I didn't tell anybody else for that same reason. Well, I was never afraid of my folks disowning me or, being angry with me. They weren't that type of people. I just didn't want my folks going to bed every night terrified that their oldest son was going to spend eternity in hell. Like that, I didn't want to put them through that. And so I didn't tell them. So it was like 6 years later that I ended up telling them. And only because my hand was forced, because I don't know if you went through this, but I kind of like my die was cast, like my type was set on the type of people I was attracted to. And they kind of looked like conservative Christians because that's all I knew. And so, once again, not easy to find an atheist, a woman out there. And so I kept dating like religious women and everything. And it was always the same. They would always start off with, oh yeah, TJ, we're cool with it, until we got serious. And then they started thinking about this. It's like, I'm going to marry this guy and we're going to have kids and I'm going to go to church and he's not. It fucked them all up.
Yeah.
And this kept happening. And my parents were like, what's going on here? Like, these women
keep losing all of these people. What is happening?
Yeah. And so it kind of forced my hand and I had to tell them. And when I did, it went as well as it could have possibly gone. And I wasn't worried about it going poorly. I was very fortunate in this aspect because a lot of people did not have that luxury and their parents, did not react to it well. But I remember telling them, and my dad said, I was deployed at the time, oddly enough. I was overseas because that's when my girlfriend broke up with me. And I was in the Army. Did not know
that.
Yeah. And so I was talking to my folks and my dad said, well, I knew something was up. I didn't know exactly what, just based on stuff that you've been posting and everything, but I didn't know what it was. And then he said something I'll never forget that was just so funny. And he says, look, I still love you. Like I always will. You'll always be my son. And as far like I wouldn't care. I don't care that you're an atheist. They said I wouldn't care if you were a Muslim. I'm like, Dad, Muslims believe in God. Like they're closer to you than I am. They're like that would.
I honestly feel like that's the only other religion they really know. They're kind of just like, well, Muslims. That's so crazy. That's such a different religion from us. And it's like you're both Abrahamic. Y'all are on this. Y'all are like, you're basically cousins. Like, come on.
Right? It's hardly a different religion at all.
Yeah.
It's hardly a different religion.
Yeah.
And one thing that so after that, I started going ham on this deconstruction shit. It was the guns of Navarone. I was Superfly TNT with this shit. I was just because, like you said, I had built up 6 years of not just frustration and depression, but actual anger because I went to a Bible college and I talked to my professors and clergymen and stuff, and I studied this and I asked all the questions that every Christian has asked, and there's no good answers for it. And I remember asking one of them about people who don't hear about the gospel, because here's something that always got me. So you have Jesus in given the Great Commission, which, by the way, is not in the original text, which I find very funny. Like that at the end of the book of Mark, and I was taught this in high school at a Christian school because it's marked in all the Bibles. Like every Bible you read these days will have like an asterisk next to the last part of the book of Mark, where Jesus is talking about the snakes and everything, holding snakes and everything. But I was like, okay, so why does Jesus tell everyone this is your great commission? You need to go into all the world and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Why did he neglect to mention, hey, by the way, there are 2 whole continents that you guys know nothing about with millions of people there. They would love to hear this. It's almost like he didn't know they were there. Like that's my guess.
That's the thing. And see, that's always like an argument that I always have, because it's like, and the thing is that what I had to learn is the idea of like God or Jesus like knowing all didn't pop up until way later, like after everything was already written. I had to figure that out later, because in the beginning, when we're raised as Christians, they teach us the way that Christianity works now. They don't really go into the history of it. They don't really go into like anything else. And so when they when they told us about that, they were like, okay, so he's all knowing, he'll always be all knowing, and that's how it's always been. But what I had to learn was that it wasn't always the case. And so when some of those books were being written and God says something like, where are you, what did you do, where's your brother, it's because he genuinely like didn't know when they were writing it. They didn't actually know. And so I honestly feel like didn't know. He didn't know at all. He had no clue. He thought they were the only ones, and that was it.
Yeah. God's a much more interesting character that way, and I want to touch on that because I love this topic about the history of God and how God has evolved over time. And one thing we used to joke in Bible college that we don't like to. So it was a Baptist college that we don't like to look too far into Christian history because you go back far enough and it's all Catholicism like that. You can't get around it. You cannot get around it. They tried to. There was always a remnant. Where I point these people out because like it seems to be all Catholic once you go beyond like 1500. So yeah.
And that's why they don't teach it. That's the reason why they don't. I'm like, and I've talked about that too. I can't remember what video it was, but I talked about that, and I was like, I really, really feel like the reason why they don't touch on the fact that there is a history is because when they talk about a history has a beginning. And so there had to have been a time when Christianity was not, and they don't want people to start thinking about that. They want to stay in this bubble of it's always been here. And it's like, no, your religion is one of the newer ones, actually. So
it's brand fucking new.
I'm like, not even your Jesus was following your religion. Like,
it's like the narcissism and the arrogance. It's funny they call us arrogant because they display just breathtaking arrogance. First off, that don't mind me, I'm just here on a mission from God. Yeah, don't mind me. I got that simple me like that. But also the way that my church and my community, or just me, the way I practice Christianity, would be indistinguishable from the way Jesus and the apostles. Are you kidding me? Like you really believe that? I want to go real quick before I forget about deconstruction and how difficult it is and why it's so annoying when people say stuff like, well, you just want to sin, or God is real. You're just not. I was like, that is such a ridiculous thing to say, that we know God's real, but we know he's real and we're just dead set on pissing him off. Why would we do that? Like, if we knew that this all-knowing, all-powerful deity would had a list of rules for us, why would I go out of my way to shit talk him and his book and his followers? And it's like,
exactly, it's
the last thing I would do.
They honestly feel that they're like, you don't know anything about Christianity, you don't know anything about God, you need to get closer to him, you're leaving because you're getting away from him, Satan's leading you astray, or whatever they can come up with at the time. And it's like, it has nothing to do with any of that, and it has everything to do with my personal belief that none of this shit is real.
That perfectly ties into what we were talking about with God and I know and everything, because I remember back in the Facebook days, I was having this argument and this guy I went to college. So I was talking about how you guys' perception of God as the Lord does not date back to the beginning of Judaism. That's not how this worked. And I brought up examples like that where God was like incredibly interrogative back in these days. Got a shitload of questions. The guy couldn't wait to find out more information. It's like, why is he asking dumbass humans these questions? And after a while, it's not to teach a lesson. Like, he genuinely wants to know.
Does he not know? Like,
yeah. And so you really see it at first when, and I'm sure then again, maybe not, maybe a lot of people just aren't inquisitive. Because I remember thinking, I'm sure you did, where you're reading through the Old Testament and you have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He conquers Pharaoh. He does the 10 plagues, and the Hebrews leave Egypt. Like, all right, cool story. And then within a matter of days, they're leaving the Lord for the rain god. And you're like, hold on, why would you do that? Like, I assume they're part of the same reasonably intelligent mammalian species that I am. Why would you give up the God of everything for a God of one thing? And I was talking about how if you read the history of this and look into, Near Eastern religions, you'll find out that you have, Abraham had El Elyon as his Elohim, which is like his God. Like, he was saying that was his God. And that's the one he chose over Baal and Asherah, and all these other gods and everything. It makes a lot more sense that way. Like, everything else in the Bible makes a lot more sense when you realize that there was a pantheon of gods. Yahweh was one of them. And
he wasn't the only one. And people, that's the problem with the whole monotheistic thing, because of the fact that they have gotten it to the point to where they're like, there's one God and that is it. And it's just the one.
Yeah.
But there's also Jesus, who's technically God, but not, but also his son, but also kind of not, because they're the same. They're on the same level of power, but Father and Son. And then there's a Holy Spirit that sneaks its way in. And so monotheistic, one God, but in three forms, but they're all the same and on the same level, but they're not. It's so confusing. It's like they can't get their mythology together.
They can't. The Trinity one. Why do they even bother? Why even bother with the Trinity thing? Because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't. Like, in any, and they try to come up with these clever, like, well, water has three forms. Like, okay, all right. Yes, water has three forms, but water cannot be liquid water and ice at the same time. It can't. That's not how this shit works. Like, it's one or the other, and it's just. And then my favorite answer to that is, well, listen, if I could understand it, then he wouldn't be God. It's like, all right, then you could say that about any God then. That's not evidence for your God at all if you can't understand it. So it doesn't help you.
That's just evidence that he made you unintelligent. Like, that's not. I'm like, what do you want? I'm like, that's the thing. That's what they be like, well, God is too big and his understanding is not our understanding. We're not going to be able to get him because he's on this level of power and all of this. And it's like, then why are we here? What is this for?
I bring this up a lot when people say this because, all right, I am willing to concede that if there were a being like this, like a God that could create a universe, yeah, I would not possibly be able to comprehend this being. I admit that. However, neither can you, which means you don't know this being's will. You don't know what this being has for our life. You don't know it any better than I do. So, trying to say that you absolutely know what God has, or like this book was definitely written by him. It could have been written by a different one. You don't know. Like,
See, those are the points that I bring up, and people get so mad at me for saying that. And I'm like, listen, first of all, God didn't write this book at all. It was a bunch of people who were apparently like inspired by him or under the spirit of him or whatever. And it's like, this book was written by man, and they're saying that they were inspired by God. How do you know, for one, that the first one who wrote, like, let's say whoever wrote the book of Genesis and whoever wrote the book of like John, how do we know that they're both listening to the same God? How do we know that? No one knows that. You don't know anything. As a matter of fact, there's stories in the Bible where people can't even tell that it's God or the God that they want or whatever. They can't tell that it's God. It ends up being somebody else. Like, there's a story where apparently, I say apparently because this is what Christian apologists try to say, not what the Bible says, but apparently Satan made himself sound like God and tricked David into doing something, and David got a punishment for doing it. And because he didn't have discernment to know that it was Satan and not God. And I'm like, with that in mind, can we look back at the entire book itself and think about how many gods there are, which the other God apparently acknowledges the fact that there are others there, and the fact that they might sound the same, they might not sound the same. You don't know who you're listening to, who you're getting your stuff from. And so it's so strange when they're like, I'm absolutely certain that this is Yahweh, this is my God, and this is the only God, and he's talking to me and telling me this and this. And it's really funny whenever you ask them, if God told you that and told them over there something else, who's right? Then they don't know what they're talking about.
That was I will get to this question. Some of your first cracks in your armor. That was a big one for me when I was in a church, and we would have business meetings like on, the one Wednesday a month or something like that. So you stay after church, and pastor would get up and he'd say, all right, so we have an idea to allocate, X amount of dollars to renovate the auditorium or, add a wing to this part of the church or whatever the fuck, they're talking about. And so he says, okay, so here's the proposition. Here's the proposition. Here's how much it's going to cost. Here's how much time it'll take. And so, look over this form or whatever and go home, pray about it. And next business meeting, we'll vote on it. So this would happen. And the church members would gather for the next business meeting and we'd vote. And the votes would be like 60-40. And I'm like, wait a minute. I was like, hold on. Like, we're all praying to the Holy Spirit here.
Yeah.
Why is the vote disparity so large? So you're telling me that either 40% of this church is wrong, is not right with God, and God's not talking, or 60% of this church is not right with God. Either way, how can we be sure that, because it should be near unanimous every single time if we're all talking to the Holy Spirit? Why is he fucking up this message delivery? It's almost like he's not talking to any of us. Like, that is kind of what it seems like.